A valley stretches wide under a gray Virginia sky. Miles of silence. Miles of nothing. Then at the end of a dirt road no one has driven in years, a rusted iron gate leans against the wind. Beyond it, a farmhouse. Windows shattered, roof sagging, walls swallowed by vines as if the land itself is trying to erase what was built here. Inside, dust covers everything. Furniture frozen in place. A coat still hanging by the door. Reading glasses resting on a side table waiting for hands that will never return. But on the kitchen counter, something that doesn't belong. A coffee cup. Recent. Still intact. Someone has been here. And in the upstairs bedroom, hidden behind a wardrobe that hasn't moved in decades, a sealed compartment holds a letter addressed to only one person. A letter from a dead woman. A letter that begins with a warning. The floorboard beneath the table creaks. It is not the wind. Her brother got everything. The mansion in Georgetown. The investment accounts worth millions. The waterfront property in Annapolis. 3 decades of carefully accumulated wealth handed over in a single afternoon. Nadine Pemberton got a farm. Not a working farm. Not a profitable farm. A rotting abandoned piece of land 4 hours from the nearest city buried deep in the Shenandoah Valley where nobody had set foot in years. But their grandmother, Vivienne Pemberton, had left behind a secret that would change everything Nadine thought she knew about her family, about money, and about what it truly means to inherit something valuable. The morning of Vivienne Pemberton's funeral arrived under a heavy Virginia sky. It was late October and the clouds hung low over the Blue Ridge foothills, pressing down on the small church where 3 generations of Pembertons had gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had held their family together for as long as anyone could remember. Nadine sat in the first pew. At 62 years old, she had the kind of face that revealed very little to strangers. Her posture was straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes were dry. But inside her chest, there was a hollow space that had been growing since the moment she received the phone call 3 days earlier. Vivienne was gone. The one person in this family who had never doubted her, never questioned her choices, never looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and dismissal that seemed to follow Nadine wherever she went. That person was gone, and the emptiness she left behind felt permanent. A few feet away, her younger brother Fletcher stood near the center aisle, receiving a steady stream of handshakes and embraces. At 58, Fletcher Pemberton looked exactly like a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure other people noticed his success. His black suit was perfectly tailored. His silver hair was neatly combed. His handshake was firm and practiced. Every word of condolence he received was met with a measured nod, a brief touch on the shoulder, a quiet "thank you for coming," that somehow made the other person feel important. Fletcher had always been good at that, standing in exactly the right place, saying exactly the right thing, projecting an image of confidence and prosperity that made people want to be near him. He had built a career in real estate development, and over the years that career had become his identity. He was the successful one. Everyone in the family agreed on that, even the people who didn't particularly like him. Nadine watched the line of mourners form around her brother and noticed something she had noticed many times before. People gravitated toward Fletcher the way they gravitate toward warmth. They wanted his attention, his approval, his proximity. Meanwhile, Nadine sat 3 feet away, and most of those same people simply nodded in her direction before moving on. She didn't blame them. She had spent most of her life being the quiet one, the one who listened more than she spoke, the one who never quite fit the image of success that her family seemed to value above everything else. After the service, the family gathered at Vivienne's old house in the center of town. It was a large colonial home with creaking floors and tall windows that let in the gray afternoon light. The living room filled quickly with relatives, some of whom Nadine hadn't seen in years. Conversations hummed in small clusters. Some people spoke about Vivienne with genuine affection. Others were already talking about what would happen next. Nadine's cousin Constance Beaumont stood near the fireplace speaking to a small group, in a voice just loud enough to carry across the room. Fletcher will get the lion's share, obviously. Everyone knows Grandma was always proudest of him. A cousin nodded. I just hope she divided things fairly for the rest of us. Nadine heard every word but said nothing. Instead, she found herself looking at something on the side table near the window. Among the flowers and framed photographs that someone had arranged for the gathering there was one image she didn't expect to see. It was a small photo in a tarnished silver frame showing Vivienne standing in front of a wooden fence, smiling with one hand resting on the top rail. Behind her stretched an enormous piece of land, green and open, under a wide skihame. Nadine didn't recognize the location. She picked up the frame and studied it more closely. Vivienne looked younger in the picture, maybe in her 60s, and there was something in her expression that Nadine couldn't quite name. It wasn't just happiness, it was purpose. She set the photo down and made a mental note to ask about it later. She didn't realize it yet, but that photograph had been placed there deliberately. It was the first clue. At 2 o'clock, attorney Lawson Calloway arrived. He was a tall man in his mid-60s with white hair and reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck. He had managed Vivienne's legal affairs for over 30 years, and the quiet authority in his voice silenced the room the moment he opened his leather briefcase. Everyone took a seat. The murmur stopped. Even the children in the hallway fell quiet as though they sensed something important was about to happen. Calloway began with the smaller bequests. Vivienne had left donations to several local organizations. She had set aside funds for 3 former employees who had worked for the family over the years. None of this surprised anyone. Vivienne had always been generous with the people she considered loyal. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. Calloway adjusted his glasses. He read slowly and clearly, and the words he spoke rearranged the atmosphere of the room in an instant. Fletcher Pemberton would inherit 3 residential properties located in the most exclusive neighborhoods outside Washington, D.C. He would also receive multiple investment accounts, corporate stock holdings, and bank deposits totaling several $1,000,000. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the murmuring began. Heads nodded. A few people exchanged knowing looks. Several relatives smiled as though this was exactly the outcome they had predicted. Fletcher kept his expression neutral, but the slight lift at the corners of his mouth betrayed his satisfaction. Constance leaned over to the person beside her and whispered, "Called it." Some cousins began congratulating Fletcher before Calloway had even finished reading. Then the attorney turned the page. Nadine Pemberton would be the sole inheritor of a rural property located in the Shenandoah Valley, approximately 4 hours from the city. A farm, nothing else. The silence that followed was different from the one before. The first silence had been anticipation. This one was shock. Several people frowned. Others looked confused. Constance's mouth opened slightly, but produced no sound. A few relatives glanced at Nadine with expressions she recognized immediately. Pity, the kind of pity that comes wrapped in relief because whatever misfortune had landed on someone else had not landed on them. Calloway continued reading the legal details of the property, but most of the room had already stopped listening. All eyes were on Nadine. She sat perfectly still. She didn't understand what she had just heard. She remembered the farm only vaguely from a single visit as a child. What little she knew was that it had been abandoned for years. The comments that had started almost immediately. Constance spoke first. Strange that Grandma left nearly everything to Fletcher and only the farm to Nadine. A cousin responded without hesitation. Well, Fletcher has always had experience managing money. Several people nodded in agreement. Then came the sentence that cut deepest. It came from an aunt seated near the window, spoken in a matter-of-fact tone that made it worse. Maybe Vivienne didn't trust that Nadine could handle a fortune that large. Nobody disagreed. A few people actually seemed to agree. Fletcher walked over to his sister. For one brief moment, Nadine thought he was going to say something kind, something that acknowledged the obvious imbalance, something that recognized her pain. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't worry about it, Aisha. That farm probably has some value. You could sell it pretty quickly and use the money for a nice retirement." Nadine looked at him. There was no cruelty in his voice. That was what made it worse. He genuinely believed she had received the lesser share, and he saw nothing wrong with that arrangement. As if it were the natural order of things. As if his worth and hers had been measured long ago, and the results were simply being confirmed. She said quietly, "You didn't even ask why she divided it this way." Fletcher shrugged. "What's to ask? She knew I had experience with assets. It's straightforward." He walked away to accept another round of congratulations, and Nadine remained in her chair, feeling the distance between them grow wider than it had ever been. The gap wasn't about money. It was about the fact that Fletcher truly believed he deserved more, and that belief required no explanation. After the crowd thinned, Attorney Calloway approached Nadine. He waited until the nearby chairs were empty, then sat down beside her and reached into his briefcase. He produced a small, sealed envelope. On the front, in Vivienne's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Only open when you have arrived at the farm." Nadine took the envelope. It was heavier than she expected. Calloway spoke quietly. "Your grandmother gave this to me separately with very specific instructions. It was to be delivered only to you, no one else. And she insisted that you visit the property before opening it. I don't know what's inside." Nadine turned the envelope over in her hands. The paper was thick cream colored, the kind Vivienne used for important correspondence. She slipped it into her coat pocket without opening it. This was the first moment since the reading of the will that she felt something other than confusion. What she felt was a faint, almost imperceptible spark of recognition. Vivienne Pemberton had been one of the sharpest, most deliberate women Nadine had ever known. She did not make careless decisions. She did not act on impulse. And she certainly did not leave things to chance. Whatever this envelope contained, it was not an afterthought. That evening, Nadine sat alone in her living room. She placed an old photograph of Vivienne on the coffee table and stared at it for a long time. The face in the picture looked back at her with steady, knowing eyes. Something didn't add up. Vivienne had always been fair. She had always been strategic. She weighed every decision carefully and considered consequences that other people couldn't see. The idea that she would divide her estate so unevenly without a reason seemed impossible. Nadine closed her eyes and let a memory surface. 3 months before Vivienne died, Nadine had visited her at the nursing facility. They sat together in the sunroom, holding hands, watching the autumn leaves drift past the window. Vivienne had squeezed her hand and said something that Nadine had dismissed at the time as a compliment from an old woman who loved her. "In this family, everyone knows how to count money, but very few people know how to see real value. You are one of those very few." Nadine had laughed softly. "You're flattering me, Grandma." Vivienne had not smiled back. Her eyes were unusually serious. "I'm not flattering you. I'm telling you the truth, and you'll understand soon enough." Sitting alone now, weeks after Vivienne's death, those words carried a completely different weight. The days that followed were difficult. Every phone call seemed to end the same way. Sell the farm, get rid of it, take whatever you can, and move on. Relatives, acquaintances, even people Nadine barely knew seemed to have an opinion about the property she had never seen. Then Gretchen Whitfield came to visit. Gretchen had been Nadine's closest friend for nearly 4 decades. She was blunt, practical, and had a way of asking the one question nobody else thought to ask. After listening to the entire story, including the will, the comments, Fletcher's reaction, and the mysterious envelope from Calloway, Gretchen set down her coffee cup and looked directly at Nadine. "Have you actually seen this farm?" "No." "Then you don't even know what you inherited." Those words stayed with Nadine long after Gretchen left. That night, she pulled out the legal documents Calloway had provided. She spread them across her kitchen table and studied them carefully. The property was enormous, hundreds of acres, far more than she had imagined. The documents listed multiple structures on the land: barns, storage buildings, old houses, facilities that appeared to have served some important purpose decades ago. But there were also unpaid property taxes, administrative fines, and accumulated maintenance costs that had never been addressed. On paper, the farm looked like an enormous financial burden. But one detail caught her attention and wouldn't let go. Vivienne had kept this property for decades. She had sold other real estate over the years, sometimes at considerable profit, but she never sold the farm. She held on to it through market booms and recessions, through offers and opportunities, through every season of her long and carefully managed financial life. Why keep this one? Why give it specifically to Nadine? Why not divide it or sell it and distribute the proceeds? The next morning, Nadine woke before dawn. She packed a bag, placed the sealed envelope from Calloway on the passenger seat of her truck, and began the 4-hour drive south into the Shenandoah Valley. The landscape changed gradually as she left the city behind. Glass and concrete gave way to rolling hills. Strip malls became small towns. The roads narrowed. As she drove, Nadine found herself thinking about the only time she had ever visited the farm. She was 9 years old. Her father, Donovan, had driven her there on a Saturday morning without explaining why. She remembered green fields, the smell of cut hay, and the sound of her grandmother's laughter echoing from a porch she could barely picture anymore. They had stayed only a few hours, and Donovan never took her back. When she asked about it years later, he changed the subject. That silence had always puzzled her. Now it felt like it might mean something. By the time she crossed into the rural counties, the world outside her window looked like a different century. Small farms dotted the hillsides. Old barns leaned against the wind. Gas stations appeared and disappeared like memories. She turned onto a county road, then a smaller road, then finally a dirt path lined with dry brush and overgrown fence posts. A rusted sign marked the entrance, but the letters had faded beyond reading. Nadine slowed the truck and followed the path. With every yard she covered, the silence grew deeper. Then the gate appeared, a massive iron structure covered in rust and neglect, leaning at angles that suggested decades of exposure to weather and indifference. The paint was gone. Some sections looked ready to collapse. Beyond the gate stretched an immense piece of land that appeared to have been forgotten by everyone except the wind. Nadine parked the truck and stepped out slowly. The silence was absolute. No machinery running, no workers, no animals, just the sound of dry branches moving in the breeze and the occasional creak of metal settling against metal. She pushed the gate open with effort, squeezing through a narrow gap, and began to walk. The main house was the first thing she saw. It must have been impressive once. The bones of the structure still suggested something grand, something built with care and ambition. But the years of abandonment had taken everything else. Several windows were shattered. Portions of the roof showed visible damage. The exterior paint had peeled away in long strips, and vegetation had begun climbing the walls and wrapping around the porch columns, as though the land itself was slowly reclaiming what had been built upon it. Nadine pushed open the front door. A heavy smell of dampness filled the air. The interior was coated in a thick layer of dust. Furniture remained in place, as though someone had walked out one day and never returned. Chairs sat around a dining table. A coat hung on a hook near the entrance. Books lined a shelf in the hallway, their spines faded and warped. On the walls hung old photographs. Several showed the farm during better times. Workers smiling beside agricultural equipment. Family gatherings on the front lawn. Green fields stretching toward the mountains under a bright summer sky. She walked through the room, slowly trailing her fingers along the dusty surfaces, trying to reconcile the lifeless house with the memory of her grandmother's laughter from 30 years ago. In the front room, she found a rocking chair facing the window. A pair of reading glasses sat on the side table, as though Vivienne had simply set them down between chapters and never returned to pick them up. Nadine touched the glasses gently, and for the first time since the funeral, felt the full weight of the loss pressing against her chest. In the hallway, she found a closet filled with old coats and boots caked in dried mud. Work clothes. Vivienne had come here not as a visitor, but as someone who walked the land, who got dirt under her fingernails, who spent hours outside in weather that most people her age would have avoided. The coats were small size for a woman who had never been tall, and seeing them hanging there in the dark waiting for an owner who would never return made the house feel less like an abandoned building and more like a place where someone had simply been interrupted. In a room at the back of the first floor, Nadine found a desk covered in dust. The drawers were empty except for a single pencil and a notepad with the top page torn off. When she held the notepad at an angle, she could see the faint impressions of words that had been written on the missing page. The indentations were too shallow to read clearly, but she could make out one word near the top, horizon. She continued exploring outside. Deteriorated storage buildings with doors ripped from their hinges. Abandoned corrals overgrown with weeds. Machinery buried under years of dust and corrosion. Every new discovery seemed to confirm what everyone had told her. This place was not a fortune, it was a burden. But then she walked into the kitchen. The counters were covered in grime. The appliances were rusted, nothing unusual. But when Nadine glanced at the small trash bin near the back door, she stopped. Inside was a paper coffee cup. It was dusty but not decomposed, not brittle with age. It looked like it had been left there recently. Maybe weeks ago, maybe a couple of months, but certainly not years. Someone had been here, recently. Nadine's pulse quickened. She looked around the kitchen with different eyes. The dust on the counter near the window was disturbed. A chair at the small table was pulled out slightly as though someone had sat there. And near the back door, the lock showed faint scratches that didn't match the general pattern of neglect covering everything else. This farm had been abandoned for years. Everyone said so. The documents confirmed it. But someone had come here not long ago, sat in this kitchen, drank coffee, and left. That changed everything. Nadine returned to the truck and retrieved the envelope from Callaway. She had arrived at the farm. She had fulfilled Vivienne's condition. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside, she found two items. The first was a hand-drawn map of the property sketched in Vivienne's careful penmanship with two locations marked in red ink. Small circles, precisely placed with numbers written beside them, 1 and 2. The second item was a letter, short, written in the same steady handwriting Nadine had known her entire life. Nadine, if you are reading this, it means you came here instead of selling the property from a distance. I knew you would. Do not listen to what others say. I have hidden the truth in several places, not because I didn't trust you, but because there are others who are also searching. Start with the location marked number 1. And remember, what you seek is not where everyone looks the first time. Nadine read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She studied the map. Location number 1 appeared to be on the far northern edge of the property, near what the map labeled as an old storage barn. She checked the time. Several hours of daylight remained. The walk took longer than expected. The vegetation had overtaken the paths, and she had to push through thick brush in several places. But eventually she spotted the structure, an old barn weathered and leaning with broken windows and a sagging roof. She entered carefully. The interior was full of old tools, empty crates, and dusty shelving. For nearly an hour, she searched without finding anything. She moved boxes, checked walls, examined the floor. Nothing. She was about to give up when she noticed something unusual on a side wall, a shape carved into one of the stones. It was small and subtle, easy to overlook. She knelt down and brushed away the grime with her fingers. A 5-pointed star, and beneath it a date, 1987. Nadine stared at the carving. Vivienne had never spoken about that year. Not once in all the conversations they had shared over 6 decades. She examined the stone more closely. It was fixed firmly in the wall, but an adjacent stone had a slight gap around its edges barely visible. She pressed it. A soft click echoed through the empty barn. Then a section of the wooden floor shifted upward, rising just enough to create a visible gap. Nadine stepped back. Her heart was pounding. She knelt and lifted the floorboard. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with concrete protected from moisture. Inside sat a sealed metal cylinder. She pulled it out, carefully opened the cap, and found several folded documents and a photograph. She looked at the photograph first. It showed Vivienne decades younger, standing beside a group of people Nadine didn't recognize. They were all smiling in front of a modern building that looked nothing like the decaying structures on the farm. On the back, written in ink, were the words, "The beginning of something that will change this entire region." Nadine turned the photograph over again and studied the faces. Whoever these people were, they had been part of something that mattered deeply to her grandmother. Then she unfolded the documents. Most contained technical diagrams, financial projections, and references she didn't fully understand. But one phrase appeared repeatedly across multiple pages, circled, underlined, emphasized in ways that made its importance unmistakable. Project Horizon. Nadine had never heard the name. Not from Vivienne, not from anyone in the family, not from any public record she had ever encountered. It was as though this project had been erased from history. That night, Nadine sat at the dining table inside the main house with the documents spread before her. Maps of the property, technical notes, names of people, dates, coordinates. Everything seemed to belong to an operation far larger than she had imagined. While Nadine sat alone in the farmhouse, surrounded by secrets, 4 hours north, her brother was living in a world that had already begun to crumble without his knowledge. Fletcher Pemberton had spent the weeks since the funeral doing what he did best, moving. He hired a new accountant. He met with 3 real estate agents about renovating one of the inherited properties. He booked a trip to Charleston that he had been postponing for 2 years. The money felt like oxygen after years of holding his breath, and he was breathing deeply. It was during a dinner at a private club in Georgetown that a mutual acquaintance introduced him to a man named Nolan Ashworth. Nolan was the kind of person who made other people feel heard. He asked questions instead of giving speeches. He complimented Fletcher's real estate knowledge without flattering him, and he spoke about financial strategies with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades watching money grow. By the end of the evening, Fletcher had agreed to a follow-up meeting. By the end of the week, Nolan was reviewing his entire portfolio. Fletcher didn't mention this to Nadine. He didn't mention it to anyone, really. It felt like a private advantage, the sort of connection that separated people who merely inherited money from people who multiplied it. Nolan reinforced that belief at every opportunity, and Fletcher, who had spent his entire life needing to be the smartest person in the room, never stopped to wonder why this brilliant man had appeared at exactly the right moment. Back at the farm, Nadine picked up her phone and called Fletcher. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the distracted energy of someone in the middle of something more important. Nadine told him what she had found: the hidden compartment, the documents, the reference to Project Horizon. Fletcher listened, then sighed. Nadine, I'm in the middle of some important meetings. Honestly, it sounds like a bunch of old papers that nobody cares about. Why don't you just hire an appraiser, get the land valued, and sell it? Grandma was 90 when she died. She may not have been thinking clearly when she wrote that will. The words hit Nadine like a slap. Not thinking clearly, she felt heat rise in her chest. She was completely clear-minded. Nadine said, her voice steady but firm, and I'm not selling. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Fletcher wasn't used to hearing that tone from his sister. Fine, he said. It's your decision. The call ended with a silence heavier than any words could have been. It was the first time in Nadine's life that she had directly refused her brother's advice. But something had shifted inside the moment she read Vivienne's letter. The farm was not a burden that had been carelessly dropped in her lap. It was a responsibility that had been deliberately placed in her hands, and she was only beginning to understand why. The next morning, Nadine drove to Millfield, the nearest town. It was a small, quiet place with a main street that still had a hardware store, a post office, and a diner with a hand-painted sign. She parked in front of a small coffee shop facing the town square and went inside. Most of the locals she spoke with knew very little about the farm. A few had vague memories of the property being active years ago, but nothing specific. Then she mentioned Vivienne's name to the man behind the counter, and an old gentleman sitting by the window looked up from his newspaper. His name was Garnett Remembers. He was 83 years old with deep lines on his face and hands that told the story of a lifetime spent working outdoors. When he heard the name Nadine Pemberton, he smiled immediately. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, he said. You knew her? Of course. For years, she used to come through here regularly. Important people visited that farm: engineers, business people, researchers. Something big was happening out there. He paused. And then one day it all just stopped. Nadine leaned forward. What do you mean stopped? Disappeared. The visitors stopped coming. The activity ended. Nobody talked about it anymore. One day it was the most exciting thing in this valley. The next day it was as if it never existed. Nadine felt the weight of those words settle over her. She asked if he had ever heard of Project Horizon. Garnett's expression changed. He set down his coffee cup. Everyone thought that farm was dead, he said slowly. But your grandmother knew what was underneath that land. She told me once years ago. She said, Garnett, someday someone in my family will come here and ask the right question. And when that happens, you'll know what to say. He looked directly at Nadine. You're the first one who's asked. The room seemed to grow quieter around them. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, trust, the beginning of an alliance that neither of them had planned but both of them understood. Garnett leaned back in his chair and told her about the valley, about the sawmill that closed in '92 and the 200 families that lost their income overnight, about the dairy cooperative that couldn't compete with industrial operations and folded 3 years later, about the school that went from 400 students to 112. He spoke without self-pity the way a man speaks about weather. These were facts. This was what happened when hope left a place and nobody came to bring it back. Your grandmother's project was the only real chance we ever had, he said. When it disappeared, people didn't just lose jobs. They lost the belief that anything could change. Before she left, Garnett placed a hand on her arm. Be careful, he said. Your grandmother had enemies. I'm old, but my eyes still work. A few weeks ago, someone came through town asking about the farm. Expensive car, clean shoes, not from around here. Nadine thanked him and walked to her truck. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she checked her rearview mirror out of habit. A black SUV was behind her, maintaining a steady distance. It stayed there for 10 minutes as she drove along the county road toward the farm. When she turned onto the dirt path leading to the property, the SUV continued straight without slowing down. Nadine noted the last 4 digits of the license plate. Then she looked ahead at the iron gate waiting at the end of the road. The farm was no longer just an inheritance. It was a puzzle that someone else was also trying to solve. That night, Nadine sat at the dining table surrounded by documents. The map Vivienne had drawn, the technical papers from the barn, the photograph of young Vivienne standing before a building that no longer existed. For the first time since the reading of the will, Nadine did not think about the injustice of the inheritance. She did not think about Fletcher's millions or Constance's whispered comments or the aunt who suggested Vivienne didn't trust her. She thought about Vivienne's letter, about the deliberate way each clue had been placed, about the man in Millfield who had been waiting years for someone to ask the right question, about the coffee cup in the kitchen that proved someone else was already here. She looked at the map, two locations marked in red. She had found the first one. The second was still waiting. Outside, the October wind swept across the dark fields of the Shenandoah Valley, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and approaching winter. Somewhere on the main road beyond the rusted gate, a black SUV sat parked with its lights off facing the direction of the farm. Nadine couldn't see it from where she sat, but she could feel deep in a place that logic couldn't reach that she was no longer alone on this land, and that the secrets buried beneath it were far more valuable than anything her brother had received in that quiet room where the will was read. The man who was slowly destroying Fletcher Pemberton's fortune had a name that Nadine had already seen written in her grandmother's handwriting, circled in red ink, followed by a single sentence: "Deny all future access." But Nadine didn't know that yet. Not on the morning she knelt on the dusty floor of the upstairs bedroom, scrubbing decades of grime from the hardwood with a brush and a bucket of water she had carried from the well outside. She had decided to stay at the farm, not for a night or a weekend, but for as long as it took to understand what Vivienne had been protecting. That meant making the main house livable one room at a time. She started with the bedroom on the second floor because it had the least water damage. The ceiling was intact, the windows were dirty but unbroken, and the old iron bed frame still stood solidly against the far wall. She swept. She wiped down surfaces. She opened the windows to let the cold mountain air flush out the smell of years of stillness. Then she turned her attention to the large wooden wardrobe standing against the east wall. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, clearly handmade with carved details along the doors that suggested it had been built during a time when craftsmanship mattered more than speed. Nadine gripped the side and pulled, intending to clean behind it. The wardrobe was heavy, but it moved, and as it slid across the floor, she noticed something that made her stop. The wall behind the wardrobe was not flat. There was a small door built into it, painted the same color as the surrounding plaster, designed to be invisible when the furniture was in place. The edges were tight. The handle was a simple metal latch, cold to the touch. Nadine's breath caught in her chest. She was not following the map this time. This was not location number 2. This was something Vivienne had hidden separately outside the system of clues tucked behind a piece of furniture in a room that most people would never bother cleaning. She pulled the latch. The door resisted, then gave way with a dry creak. Behind it was a shallow compartment recessed into the wall, roughly the size of a small cabinet. Inside, she found a leather-bound notebook, a brass key wrapped in cloth, and a folded piece of paper. She opened the notebook first. It was not a collection of technical documents like the ones she had found in the barn. This was personal. It was Vivienne's diary. The entries spanned several years, written in a hand that grew slightly less steady as the pages progressed. Vivienne wrote about the farm, about the people who worked on the project, about the challenges they faced. But she also wrote about her family. And on one page, Nadine found a passage that made her sit down on the edge of the bed and read it 3 times. "Donovan does not agree with me. He thinks I am being too suspicious. But I have seen what Benton Ashworth truly wants. It is not partnership, it is seizure." Donovan, her father. The man Nadine remembered as gentle and quiet, a schoolteacher who spent his evenings reading history books and helping her with homework. She had never imagined he had been involved in any disagreement with Vivienne, let alone something this serious. She continued reading. The diary revealed that her father had believed Vivienne was being overly cautious, that she was rejecting financial partnerships that could have accelerated the project. The disagreement had caused a temporary rift between them. Donovan never tried to harm the project. He simply couldn't see what Vivienne saw. He trusted people she didn't trust, and that difference in judgment had strained their relationship for years. Nadine closed the notebook slowly. She had come to the farm looking for answers about a secret project. Instead, she was finding layers of her own family history that no one had ever shared with her. She picked up the brass key and examined it. It was old, heavy, clearly made for a substantial lock. Beside it, the folded paper contained a single line in Vivienne's handwriting. When you find this, you still won't have all the answers. Look for the place where everything began. She tucked the key into her jacket pocket and carried the notebook downstairs. 2 days later, Garnett Remembers arrived at the farm unannounced. He came in a battered pickup truck carrying a cardboard box that he placed on the kitchen table with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable. "Found these at my house," he said. "Thought they might help." Inside the box were photographs, old newspapers, and documents related to the region's history. Nadine sorted through them carefully while Garnett sat across from her, drinking coffee from a thermos he had brought himself. Among the papers, she found a photograph that stopped her cold. It showed Vivienne standing before a large banner that read Regional Center Horizon in bold letters. The image was dated 35 years earlier. Vivienne was surrounded by a group of people, some in suits, some in work clothes, all of them looking at the camera with the unmistakable expression of people who believed they were building something that mattered. Garnett nodded when he saw the photograph. "I remember that day. The whole town was there. We thought our lives were about to change." He stayed the entire afternoon. They sat together at the kitchen table, and Garnett told her things that no document could contain. He told her about the families who had lost their farms when the local economy collapsed, about the young people who left for the cities and never came back, about the businesses that closed one by one until Millfield became a place people drove through instead of a place people lived. "Your grandmother's project was the only real hope we ever had," he said. "When it disappeared, a lot of people lost more than jobs. They lost the belief that things could get better." When Garnett left that evening, Nadine watched his truck disappear down the dirt road and felt something she hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for the documents or the photographs, but for the presence of someone who understood why this mattered. That night, she returned to Vivienne's diary and continued reading. The entries from the final years were more guarded, more cautious. Vivienne had begun recording the names of people who visited the farm, along with dates and brief notes about each visit. Most names meant nothing to Nadine, but one name appeared repeatedly across multiple entries, growing more frequent as the pages progressed. Nolan Ashworth. There were records of meetings, requests for access to property documents, exchanges of information about the project's scope and assets. The entries showed a pattern of increasing involvement, as though this person had been methodically working his way deeper into Vivienne's operation. Then the entries stopped abruptly. On the last page that mentioned the name, Vivienne had written in capital letters, "Deny all future access." Nadine stared at those words. Then she opened her laptop and searched for the name. Nolan Ashworth, investment consultant based in Northern Virginia, active in several development projects across the Mid-Atlantic region. His professional photograph showed a man in his early 50s with a confident smile and careful eyes. Nadine recognized that face, not because she had met him, but because Fletcher had mentioned him. 2 weeks ago, during one of their brief phone conversations, Fletcher had casually boasted about a brilliant financial advisor he had recently connected with, someone who was helping him maximize the returns on his inheritance. Someone named Nolan. The blood drained from Nadine's face. She grabbed her phone and called Fletcher immediately. He answered on the third ring, sounding relaxed. She told him what she had found. Vivienne's diary, the repeated entries, the explicit ban on future access. She told him that the man sitting across from him in business meetings was the same man their grandmother had identified as a threat and permanently barred from the property. Fletcher laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind that comes from someone who has already decided the other person is wrong. "You're being paranoid, Nadine. Nolan was introduced to me by very reputable people. Grandma was old. Maybe she made a mistake." "She didn't make a mistake. She banned this man for a reason. Do you have any idea how much money Nolan has generated for me already? Don't sabotage this." The line went quiet. Nadine could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. "I'm trying to protect you," she said. "I don't need protection. I need you to stop digging through old papers and start living in the real world." The call ended. Fletcher had chosen to trust a stranger over his own sister. Nadine set down the phone, and for the first time since arriving at the farm, she felt truly alone. What she didn't know was that Fletcher's confidence was already beginning to fracture, though not because of anything she had said. 2 days after their conversation, a real estate development fund that Nolan had recommended lost 40% of its value in a single week. Fletcher called Nolan in a panic. Nolan responded with absolute calm, explaining that market corrections were normal, that the fund would recover within months, and that this was actually an opportunity to invest more at a lower price. Fletcher wanted to believe him. He needed to believe him because the alternative was admitting that he had entrusted a significant portion of his inheritance to a man he barely knew. He invested more. The fund continued to drop. A second investment, this one in a private infrastructure project, was suspended due to what Nolan described as routine regulatory delays. Fletcher began checking his accounts 3 times a day, then 5, then every hour. The numbers moved in only one direction. But every time he considered pulling out, Nolan appeared with a new explanation, a new projection, a new assurance that the worst was behind them. And every time Fletcher chose to stay, because leaving would mean admitting he had been wrong, and Fletcher Pemberton had spent his entire life making sure he was never wrong about anything. 3 nights later, back at the farm, a storm rolled through the valley. Thunder shook the walls of the old house. Rain hammered the windows. Nadine fell asleep to the sound of wind tearing through the trees outside. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that was not wind. It was a creak, slow and deliberate, coming from the first floor. She lay still, listening. It came again, then a third time. Someone was moving through the house. Nadine reached for the flashlight beside her bed and rose silently. She moved to the hallway and stood at the top of the stairs, barely breathing. Below, she could hear the faint rustle of papers being moved, the sound of a drawer opening, the soft thud of something being placed on a surface. She descended the stairs 1 step at a time. When she reached the dining room, she found the back door standing open. Rain was blowing in across the floor. The documents she had organized on the table were scattered. Several folders were missing entirely. She checked the rest of the house. Whoever had been there was gone. At dawn, she surveyed the damage. The missing folders contained some of the most important documents from the later years of Project Horizon. Financial agreements, correspondence, records that connected specific individuals to decisions that had shut the project down. Outside, she found boot prints near a side window. Large, heavy treads pressed deep into the mud. Tire tracks on the main road leading away from the property. And on the front porch, a cigarette butt, an expensive brand, the same kind she had smelled that day outside the coffee shop in Millfield when she had nearly bumped into a stranger who smiled too quickly and disappeared too fast. Nadine called the county sheriff. Rayburn Fairchild arrived 40 minutes later in a tan cruiser with mud on the fenders. He was a thick-shouldered man in his mid-50s who looked like he had spent most of his career dealing with livestock disputes and speeding tickets. He walked through the house, took notes, and examined the boot prints with the enthusiasm of someone filling out a form. "Could be kids," he said. "Abandoned property like this, you get trespassers sometimes." These weren't kids. Specific documents were taken. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. Fairchild shrugged. "No cameras, no witnesses. Storm washed away most of the evidence. I'll file a report, but I wouldn't expect much." Nadine watched him drive away and felt the familiar sting of being dismissed. A 62-year-old woman standing alone on a porch in a rural county, reporting a crime that nobody wanted to investigate. She understood how it looked to a man like Fairchild. She also understood that waiting for someone else to take her seriously was no longer an option. If the law wouldn't protect her, she would protect herself. That afternoon, she drove to the hardware store in Millfield and purchased a basic security camera. She mounted it herself on a post near the front gate, angling it to capture the road and the entrance. Then she found the envelope. It had been slipped under the front door while she was in town. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message: "Stop searching and sell the property while you still can." Nadine read it 3 times. There was no explicit threat, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone wanted her gone. She photographed the letter and sent it to her personal attorney and to Gretchen. Gretchen called back within minutes, her voice tight with concern. "Come back to the city. That place is dangerous." Nadine stood on the porch looking out at the fields that stretched toward the mountains. "If I leave now, whoever sent this letter wins. And my grandmother spent her entire life making sure they didn't win." She hung up and went back inside. The decision had been made. She was staying. Not because she wasn't frightened, but because fear was no longer a sufficient reason to stop. The following week, Nadine made 2 visits that changed her understanding of everything. The first was to Vaughn Kincaid, an 82-year-old man who had been one of Vivienne's closest collaborators during the early years of the project. He lived in a small community 3 hours south in a house surrounded by walnut trees and stacked firewood. Vaughn welcomed Nadine and upon hearing why she had come, immediately drove her to meet Maxine Garraway, the niece of Deirdre Garraway, Vivienne's most trusted partner during the project's peak years. Maxine lived nearby, and within an hour, all three of them were seated around a table covered with old photographs and documents. Vaughn poured coffee for everyone and sat down heavily, the way old men do when they know they're about to talk about something that has weighed on them for a very long time. He placed both hands flat on the table and looked at Nadine with an expression that was both kind and deeply serious. "I've been waiting for someone to come asking about this," he said. 30 years is a long time to carry a story that nobody wants to hear. Vaughn spoke first about the early days of the project. He told Nadine about Benton Ashworth, Nolan's father. Benton had arrived at the project decades ago with promises of investment, connections, and growth. Vivienne trusted him initially, everyone did. But over time, Vaughn said things started to change. He pushed for control. He wanted decision-making power over the project's direction, its finances, its partnerships. When your grandmother realized what he was really after, she cut all ties. "And after that," Nadine asked, "legal disputes, missing documents, constant pressure. We could never prove who was behind it all, but the suspicion always pointed in the same direction." Maxine added something that embedded itself in Nadine's mind like a splinter. "My aunt always said the real danger never came from strangers. It came from the people closest to you." Vaughn reached into a folder and produced a photograph taken at a project meeting decades earlier. Among the attendees was a younger man whose resemblance to Nolan Ashworth was unmistakable. Benton Ashworth standing near Vivienne, smiling for the camera while planning to take everything she had built. Maxine walked Nadine to the door and held her hand for a moment. "Deirdre never got over what happened to the project," she said quietly. "She died believing nobody would ever try again. Please prove her wrong." Nadine drove home that night with the photograph on the seat beside her, feeling the past and the present collapsing into each other. 3 days later, she visited the county records office to research the property's land history. Behind the counter sat Rosalind Holbrook, a woman in her early 50s with reading glasses and a careful manner. When Nadine requested access to the older property files, Rosalind hesitated. She offered vague administrative reasons for the delay. Something about processing times and restricted archives. Nadine left without the records, but the interaction bothered her. The hesitation felt manufactured. She was right. 3 days later, Rosalind called Nadine directly. Her voice was unsteady. "I need to meet with you privately. There's something I should have told you." They met at a diner outside Millfield. Rosalind arrived looking like she hadn't slept. She explained that Nolan Ashworth had contacted her weeks earlier, pressuring her to limit access to certain historical property records. She had complied out of fear for her job, but what she discovered in the process had kept her awake every night since. Buried deep in the county archives were documents showing that Benton Ashworth had filed fraudulent land claims against the farm 30 years ago, attempting to seize control of a section of the property through falsified paperwork. Vivienne had fought the claim in court for years and eventually won, but the records had been buried so deep in the county filing system that no one had looked at them since. "I was afraid of losing my position," Rosalind said, "but I can't watch this happen again." Nadine now had official administrative evidence, not just personal letters, not just family diaries. Government records that proved a pattern of fraud stretching back decades. The confrontation came sooner than Nadine expected. Fletcher called to say he wanted to visit the farm with an associate. Nadine agreed. She already knew who the associate would be. When Fletcher's car pulled through the gate, Nolan Ashworth stepped out of the passenger side. He surveyed the property with the measured gaze of someone appraising an asset, not admiring a landscape. His shoes were polished. His coat was expensive. He smiled at Nadine with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent his career making other people comfortable before taking what he wanted. They sat in the main house. Nolan spoke for 20 minutes about development opportunities, investment, potential, partnership structures. His voice was smooth and confident, his arguments layered with numbers and projections designed to make refusal seem irrational. Nadine listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke calmly. "Mr. Ashworth, I know that your father, Benton Ashworth, tried to take this farm 30 years ago through fraudulent land claims. I know that my grandmother banned you from this property permanently. And I know that your interest in advising my brother has nothing to do with his financial well-being." The silence that followed was absolute. Nolan's composure cracked. Only for a second, A tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in posture. But it was enough. Fletcher, sitting between them, saw it. He looked at Nolan, then at Nadine, then back at Nolan. Something shifted behind his eyes. Nolan recovered quickly. "You're letting old paperwork cloud your judgment," he said. He turned to Fletcher. "We should go." On the drive back, Fletcher asked Nolan about Nadine's accusations. Nolan dismissed them without elaboration. But the seed had been planted. For the first time, Fletcher had seen the mask slip, and the face beneath it did not match the one he had trusted. 2 weeks passed. Nadine continued her work at the farm, reviewing the security camera footage each morning. Then on a Thursday night, the camera captured a vehicle parking near the gate with its headlights off. Nadine did not panic. She picked up her phone and called Sheriff Fairchild first. Then she walked onto the front porch. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps and looked up at her. "You're causing problems for people you shouldn't be causing problems for," he said. His voice was flat, practiced. "Sell the farm, take the money, live a quiet life. This is the last time you'll be warned." Nadine kept her hands visible and her voice level. "You're trespassing on private property. I've already called the sheriff." For a moment, the man didn't move. Then headlights appeared on the road behind him. A tan cruiser with a light bar rolling slowly toward the gate. Sheriff Fairchild stepped out of his vehicle. This time his demeanor was entirely different. He saw the man. He heard the audio recording Nadine had captured on her phone. He examined the camera footage. He took down the man's identification. The man's name was Leland Everton. Before Fairchild put him in the back of the cruiser, Leland said one thing that Nadine would remember for a long time. "I'm just hired help. He won't stop." Fairchild turned to Nadine. "I owe you an apology. I should have taken this seriously from the start. From now on, I'll have a patrol car coming through here regularly." Nadine watched the cruiser disappear down the road and allowed herself a single deep breath. She had been frightened, she had been threatened, and she had stood her ground. The next morning, she returned to Vivienne's map. One marked location remained. Number 2. It pointed to an area behind the cluster of abandoned outbuildings on the far southern edge of the property, near a stone structure she had noticed during earlier walks, but never investigated closely. She arrived at the building after a 30-minute walk through overgrown brush. It was a squat, partially collapsed stone structure with no windows and a heavy iron door half buried in the earth. The door was locked. The lock was old, substantial, and covered in rust. Nadine reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key she had found behind the wardrobe weeks earlier. She slid it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it turn. A solid click resonated through the stone. She pushed the door open. Cool air rushed out from below. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Nadine switched on her flashlight and began to descend. At the bottom, she found a room that took her breath away. It was not a cellar or a crawl space. It was a fully constructed underground archive, roughly the size of a large office, with concrete walls sealed against moisture, metal shelving lining every surface, and filing cabinets arranged in precise rows. The air was cool and dry. Everything was organized with the meticulous care of someone who intended this space to survive for decades. Nadine moved through the room, slowly running her fingers along the edges of the cabinets. She opened the first one and found completed research reports, economic projections, development blueprints. She opened the second and found signed agreements between Vivienne and agricultural specialists, engineers, and community organizations. The third cabinet contained correspondence with government agencies, academic institutions, and nonprofit partners who had studied and endorsed the project over many years. The scope of what Vivienne had built was staggering. Project Horizon was not a simple farming operation. It was a comprehensive regional development model designed to create permanent employment support, small producers, train rural families, build infrastructure, and generate sustainable economic growth across an entire valley. Vivienne had worked on this for years, quietly, methodically, without asking for recognition or credit. But the archive also contained something darker. In a separate section, Nadine found files documenting systematic attempts to sabotage the project from within. Legal challenges manufactured out of thin air, key documents that vanished at critical moments, internal conflicts that appeared to have been deliberately engineered. And in a folder marked confidential in red letters, she found a list of names, people who had been involved in the sabotage efforts. Some she didn't recognize, But one surname belonged to her own family, and another belonged to a man whose son was at this very moment advising her brother on how to invest his inheritance. Nadine sat in the underground room for a long time, surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's life work and the proof of the forces that had tried to destroy it. Then she found a short note tucked into a metal box at the far end of the room, written in Vivienne's handwriting addressed to her. It read, "The farm was entrusted to you for reasons that will become clear before the end. Do not sell. Do not stop searching. The most important truth is still ahead of you." Nadine folded the note carefully, placed it in her jacket, and climbed the stairs back into daylight. The sun was already low when she emerged. She stood at the entrance to the underground archive and looked across the fields, seeing them for what they were for the first time. Not abandoned land, not a burden, a foundation, waiting. But the moment of clarity was short. 4 days later, Nadine received a legal notice delivered by courier. Nolan Ashworth, acting through a team of attorneys, had filed a motion in county court requesting a temporary freeze on all assets associated with the farm property. The stated grounds an unresolved inheritance dispute requiring judicial review. The court had granted a temporary order. The farm was frozen. Nadine could not repair it, could not develop it, could not use it for any purpose until the court reviewed the case. Everything she had built over the past months, every plan, every connection, every step toward bringing Vivienne's vision back to life could be erased by a single piece of paper signed by a judge who had never set foot on this land. That night, Nadine sat alone in the dark kitchen of the main house. The security camera light blinked quietly near the window. The documents from the underground archive sat in boxes around her. She sat there for a long time without moving. The legal notice lay on the table in front of her, its language cold and precise, written by people who had never walked this land or touched its soil or read the words Vivienne had hidden inside its walls. They didn't know about the five-pointed star in the barn. They didn't know about the diary behind the wardrobe. They didn't know about the families in Millfield who had been waiting 35 years for someone to keep a promise that the rest of the world had forgotten. To them, this was just a property dispute, a line item, a case number. Nadine thought about packing her things and driving back to the city. She thought about calling a real estate agent and putting the land on the market. She thought about how easy it would be to tell herself that she had tried, that the fight was too big, that some battles were meant to be lost. She thought about all of this clearly and specifically the way a person thinks about stepping off a cliff, measuring the distance to the bottom, and wondering if the fall would hurt. She called Gretchen. Her friend answered immediately, hearing something in the silence before Nadine even spoke. "Do you want to stop?" Gretchen asked. Nadine closed her eyes. She thought about Vivienne, who had fought alone for 30 years, who had hidden evidence in walls and underground rooms and sealed envelopes because she knew that someday the fight would continue, who had chosen Nadine not because she was the strongest or the smartest, but because she was the one who wouldn't quit. "My grandmother fought alone for 3 decades, Nadine said quietly. "I've only been fighting for a few months." She hung up. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she opened the legal documents spread across the table and began looking for a way to fight back. Outside, the valley was dark and silent. But somewhere to the north, Fletcher Pemberton was sitting in his own kitchen, staring at bank statements that no longer made sense, slowly realizing that the man he had trusted with his fortune was the same man trying to take his sister's farm. And for the first time in his life, Fletcher was beginning to understand that he might have been wrong about everything. Fletcher Pemberton discovered the truth on a Tuesday evening, alone in his study, surrounded by financial documents he had been avoiding for weeks. He had told himself for months that the losses were temporary, that markets fluctuate, that every successful investor endures setbacks before the returns arrive. Nolan Ashworth had repeated those reassurances so many times that Fletcher had absorbed them, like scripture, reciting them to himself each morning when the numbers on his screen looked worse than the day before. But tonight, with no one watching and no one to perform for, Fletcher finally did what he had been afraid to do. He pulled every statement, every contract, every transaction record from the past 6 months and laid them across his desk in chronological order. What he found made his hands go cold. 3 transactions totaling nearly $400,000 had been executed from accounts Fletcher controlled, but he had never authorized them. The signatures on the approval forms looked like his, but the dates didn't match his calendar. He had been traveling on 2 of those days and, in a hospital waiting room on the third, getting a routine procedure that had kept him sedated for most of the afternoon. He kept digging. The administrative fees charged across his portfolio were nearly triple the industry standard. Several of the funds Nolan had recommended were managed by entities whose registered addresses led to the same small office building in Delaware. And the single largest loss in Fletcher's portfolio, a development project that had collapsed spectacularly 2 months ago, was operated by a company whose board of directors included a name Fletcher recognized from Nolan's personal contacts. Fletcher sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He had been used, carefully, patiently, and thoroughly. Nolan hadn't needed to steal from him in any crude or obvious way. He had simply guided Fletcher toward decisions that moved money from Fletcher's accounts into structures that Nolan and his associates controlled. Every recommendation had been a gentle push toward the edge of a cliff that Fletcher never saw because he was too busy admiring the view. The next morning, Fletcher drove to Nolan's office for what would be their final meeting. He didn't call ahead. He walked past the receptionist, opened the door to Nolan's private office, and sat down across from the man who had dismantled his fortune piece by piece. Nolan looked up from his desk with the same composed expression he always wore. Calm, professional, slightly amused, as though every interaction were a chess game he had already won. Fletcher didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply placed 3 printed documents on the desk between them. The unauthorized transactions, the dates, the signatures that couldn't have been his. Nolan glanced at the papers. For the first time in their entire relationship, he did not respond immediately. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough. It was the silence of a man recalculating, and Fletcher recognized it because he had spent his entire career reading people across negotiating tables. "These are routine processing adjustments," Nolan said finally. "I can walk you through each one. You can't walk me through a signature I didn't make on a day I was under anesthesia." Another pause, longer this time. Fletcher stood. "I gave you my money, my access, and my trust. That's finished." He walked out of the office without looking back. In the parking garage, he sat in his car for 20 minutes before starting the engine. He was not thinking about the money. He was thinking about Nadine, about the phone call weeks ago when she had warned him, about the certainty in her voice when she said Vivienne had banned this man for a reason, about the way he had laughed and told her she was being paranoid. He had chosen to believe a stranger over his own sister, and that choice had cost him far more than money. Fletcher did not drive home. He turned south and headed for the Shenandoah Valley. The drive took 4 hours, the same 4 hours Nadine had driven months earlier. But Fletcher experienced them differently. Nadine had driven south with curiosity and uncertainty. Fletcher drove south with the accumulated weight of every bad decision he had made since the day the will was read. He replayed conversations in his mind. The dinner where Nolan first appeared. The handshake that felt so reassuring. The documents he signed without reading, because reading them would have meant admitting he didn't understand them. The phone call where Nadine warned him and he laughed. Each memory was sharper than the last, and by the time the mountains appeared on the horizon, Fletcher understood something he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. He was not the man he had pretended to be. He never had been. He arrived at the farm in the late afternoon without calling ahead. No lawyers accompanied him. No advisors. No one to perform for, and no one to impress. When he stepped out of his car and walked toward the main house, Nadine was standing on the porch. She had seen his car approaching on the security camera feed and had come outside to meet him. She studied his face as he crossed the yard. Something fundamental had changed in her brother. The careful posture was gone. The practiced confidence had evaporated. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally set it down, not because he wanted to, but because his arms had given out. They sat on the porch in 2 old wooden chairs that Nadine had cleaned and repaired during her first week at the farm. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the bare trees along the fence line and the distant call of a hawk circling above the far pasture. Fletcher spoke first. He told her everything. The failed investments, the unauthorized transactions, the pattern of manipulation that he could now see clearly, but had been blind to for months. He told her that Nolan's recommendations had never been about helping him grow his wealth. They had been about extracting it slowly and systematically while keeping Fletcher distracted with promises of even greater returns. Then he said something Nadine had never expected to hear. The day the will was read, when you got the farm and everyone went quiet, I felt relieved. He paused. Not for you, for me. I looked around that room and thought, good, she got the short end. Grandma knew who deserved the real inheritance. I actually believe that. He swallowed. I'm ashamed of that, deeply ashamed. Nadine said nothing for a while. She reached inside the door and brought out 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to her brother. They sat together watching the fields turn gold in the fading light, and for the first time in many months, there was nothing to prove between them. I spent the first week here hating this place, Nadine said. I walked through the house and saw broken windows and dust and rotting wood, and I thought you were right. I thought Grandma had given me the short end. She took a sip of coffee. But then I started cleaning, and I found things she had hidden, things she spent decades protecting. And I realized she hadn't punished me. She had chosen me. Fletcher looked at her. Chosen you for what? For the only thing she ever cared about more than this family. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when did you stop being angry at me? Nadine considered the question. Somewhere between the second death threat and the court order freezing my property. Fletcher stared at her. Death threats. That's what I've been trying to tell you for months. This wasn't just about old documents. People broke into this house. A man came to my porch at night and told me to sell or face consequences. The sheriff had to start running patrols out here. Fletcher's face went pale. I had no idea. You weren't listening. The words landed without malice, but they landed hard. Fletcher pressed his lips together and looked at the fields. No, he said. I wasn't. They sat in the silence for a while longer, and in that silence, something shifted between them that no conversation could have achieved. It was the silence of 2 people who had hurt each other and were choosing carefully and deliberately to stop. Come inside, Nadine said. I'll show you what Grandma built. She led him downstairs to the underground archive. She showed him everything. The research files, the development plans, the sabotage documentation, Vivienne's diary entries about their father, the evidence connecting Benton Ashworth's decades-old campaign to Nolan's present-day activities. Fletcher read through the documents with the slow, painful focus of a man recognizing his own role in a story he wished he could rewrite. When he reached the files detailing how Benton Ashworth had used fraudulent land claims to attack the farm 30 years ago, he closed the folder and pressed his palms against his eyes. I was the next chapter, he said quietly. Nolan didn't need to forge land claims. He just needed someone in the family who was too proud to ask questions. Nadine let the words settle. Then she said, you have financial records that Nolan doesn't want anyone to see. I have historical evidence that proves a pattern going back 30 years. Rosalind Holbrook at the county office has administrative records showing the original fraud. Separately, none of it is enough. Together, it's everything. Fletcher looked at her. The court froze the farm. I know. That's why we need to move quickly. For the first time in his life, Fletcher Pemberton followed his sister's lead. Over the next 10 days, they assembled a small team. Nadine's attorney handled the legal framework. Rosalind Holbrook organized the county records into a formal evidentiary package. Sheriff Fairchild provided the official reports documenting the trespassing incidents and Leland Everton's recorded threats. And Fletcher contributed the piece that only he could provide a complete financial trail, showing how Nolan Ashworth had systematically manipulated his investments through entities connected to the same network that had targeted Vivienne's project decades earlier. They met at the farmhouse kitchen table, the same table where Nadine had spread Vivienne's documents on her first night at the property. Nadine stood at one end, Fletcher sat to her right. Rosalind and the attorney occupied the other chairs. Fairchild leaned against the door frame with his arms folded. Then Garnett Graydon appeared in the doorway. Nobody had invited him. He had driven himself from Millfield 40 minutes on roads he had traveled for 80 years. He stood there in his worn jacket, holding his hat in both hands, his back slightly bent, but his eyes sharp and clear. I'm 83 years old, he said. I remember everything that happened. If you need someone to testify about what went on 30 years ago, I'm here. Nadine looked at the old man standing in her grandmother's doorway, offering the only thing he had left to give, and understood that this fight had never belonged to her alone. It belonged to every person in Millfield who had watched their hopes disappear when the project died. It belonged to every family that had packed up and left because there was nothing worth staying for. Fletcher stood up and offered Garnett his chair. The old man sat down, placed his hat on the table, and looked around the room at each face. Well then, he said, let's finish what Vivienne started. But Nolan Ashworth was not finished. 3 days before the scheduled court hearing, Nadine began receiving phone calls from people she had never spoken to, farmers from neighboring properties, small business owners in Millfield, members of the local church council, all of them asking the same question, phrased in slightly different ways, but carrying the same accusation. We heard you're planning to turn the farm into a private resort. Is that true? Someone told us you're going to block the water access for the whole valley. Is it true you're selling the land to a development company from out of state? The rumors had been planted, carefully designed to turn the community against Nadine at the worst possible moment. She traced them back through conversations until a pattern emerged. Leland Everton, released on bail, had been visiting farms and businesses throughout the area, spreading a version of Nadine's plans that bore no resemblance to reality. The damage was immediate. People who had been cautiously supportive now looked at Nadine with suspicion. A farmer she had spoken to the previous week crossed the street to avoid her in Millfield. Nadine knew she couldn't fight the rumors with words alone. She called a community meeting at the Millfield Town Hall for that evening. 40 people came. Some were curious, some were hostile. A few stood near the back with their arms crossed, waiting to hear what the outsider had to say for herself. Nadine did not defend herself. She did not talk about the break-ins, the threats, or the legal battles. Instead, she opened a folder and began reading directly from Vivienne's original project plans. She read the names of every community Vivienne had studied. She read the employment projections, the training programs designed for local young people, the water-sharing agreements that Vivienne had drafted to ensure every neighboring farm would benefit from the infrastructure improvements, the cooperative purchasing system that would have reduced costs for small producers across the entire valley. She read for 15 minutes. The room grew quieter with every page. A woman in the third row leaned forward. Nadine Pemberton wrote all of this. She spent over 20 years developing it, Nadine said. Every community in this valley is mentioned by name. Every family that farms within 10 miles of this property was included in her calculations. She didn't build this for herself. She built it for you. An older man near this middle raised his hand. My father used to talk about a project out at that farm, said it was going to bring jobs back. I was 12 years old. I thought he was making it up. He wasn't, Nadine said. Your father's name might be in these pages. A lot of your families are. The room shifted. People who had been leaning back in their chairs leaned forward. A few pulled out their phones to take notes. A teenage girl sitting with her mother whispered, "Is this for real?" Her mother didn't answer, but her expression said she was beginning to believe it might be. When she finished, Garnett Graydon rose from his chair in the front row. He turned to face the room. His voice was slow, but every word carried the weight of a man who had waited 35 years for this moment. I knew Vivienne Pemberton when she was younger than most of you in this room. She never took anything from anyone. She built. That's all she ever did. And the people who destroyed her project are the same people spreading lies about her granddaughter right now. I watched it happen once. I won't watch it happen again. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Then the farmer who had crossed the street to avoid Nadine that morning nodded slowly. A younger man near the back uncrossed his arms. Nobody objected. The tide had turned. The hearing took place at the county courthouse on a cold November morning. The courtroom was small, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that gave everyone's face a slightly exhausted look. Nolan Ashworth arrived with 2 attorneys in expensive suits and the confident posture of someone who had navigated legal proceedings many times before. Nadine arrived with evidence from 4 separate sources, 3 witnesses, in the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent months uncovering a truth that others had spent decades trying to bury. Rosalind Holbrook testified first. She described the pressure Nolan had applied to restrict access to county records. She presented the historical files showing Benton Ashworth's fraudulent land claims from 30 years earlier, complete with forged documents and falsified surveys. When Nolan's attorney asked why she hadn't reported the irregularities sooner, Rosalind removed her glasses and answered without hesitation. Because I was afraid, and I am ashamed that I was afraid for so long. Fletcher testified next. He presented the financial records methodically, walking the judge through each unauthorized transaction, each connected entity, each fee structure designed to extract wealth while creating the appearance of legitimate investment management. When he finished, he turned and looked at Nolan directly. "I trusted you," Fletcher said. His voice held no anger, only a sadness that filled the courtroom like cold water. "That was my mistake. But what you did with that trust that was yours." Garnett Graydon took the stand last. He spoke about Vivienne Pemberton, about the project she had built, about the day Benton Ashworth first arrived in Millfield with his promises and his handshake. He described the slow unraveling, the meetings that stopped, the families that left, the silence that settled over the valley. "I'm 3 years old," Garnett said. "I don't have anything left to lose and nothing left to be afraid of. I'm telling you what I saw because someone should have told you 30 years ago." Nolan's attorneys attempted to discredit each witness. They questioned Rosalind's motives. They suggested Fletcher's testimony was biased by sibling loyalty. They implied that Garnett's age made his memory unreliable. None of it worked. The evidence was too consistent, too documented, too thoroughly cross-referenced across independent sources. When the judge asked Nolan directly to explain the connection between his activities and his father's documented attempts to seize the property 3 decades earlier, Nolan's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, not with shouting or visible rage. It broke the way a wall breaks when the foundation beneath it has been quietly crumbling for years. His answers became circular. His explanations contradicted each other. His attorneys requested a recess that the judge denied. The ruling came before noon. All claims against the property were dismissed. The asset freeze was lifted immediately. Nadine's ownership was confirmed in full. And the court referred Nolan Ashworth's financial activities to the State Investigation Bureau for further review. Nolan left the courtroom without looking at anyone. His attorneys gathered their papers in silence and followed him out through a side door. The room emptied slowly, but the people from Millfield, who had driven 2 hours to attend, stayed in their seats for a few moments longer, as though they needed time to absorb what had just happened. A woman in the back row put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes. A man near the aisle reached for his wife's hand and held it. Rosalind Holbrook walked past Nadine on her way out. She paused, adjusted her glasses, and said quietly, "Your grandmother would have won this fight herself if she'd had the chance. I'm glad you finished it for her." Then she walked out into the November morning without looking back. Outside the courthouse, Nadine stood on the stone steps and breathed the cold air. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the mountains in the distance were sharp against the horizon. Fletcher walked out a few minutes later and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. Then Garnett Graydon came through the doors, moving slowly, gripping the iron railing. He stopped next to Fletcher and looked at the younger man for a long moment. "Mistakes don't define a person," Garnett said. "How you fix them does." Fletcher looked at the old man and, for the first time in as long as Nadine could remember, did not try to appear strong. He simply nodded, and the nod contained everything he couldn't say. The months that followed transformed the farm in ways that would have seemed impossible on the day Nadine first pushed open the rusted gate. Roads were repaired, buildings were restored, systems that had sat idle for decades were brought back to service. The work began with Nadine and a small crew, but it grew quickly as people from Millfield and the surrounding communities began to arrive. Some came because they needed jobs. Some came because they remembered their parents talking about the project that had almost changed their lives. Some came because they had seen Nadine stand in front of 40 skeptical people in a town hall and read from plans that had been written for them by a woman they had never met. Small producers received technical support for the first time. Young people from farming families enrolled in training programs that taught skills their parents never had access to. Legitimate investors, attracted by the transparency with which Nadine managed every decision, began committing resources to long-term development. The farm became a hub. Then it became a center. Then it became the beating heart of a valley that had spent 35 years waiting to come back to life. The old barn where Nadine had found the five-pointed star became a community workshop. The main house, once covered in dust and silence, now served as the project's administrative headquarters, its rooms filled with maps and planning documents, and the constant hum of people building something together. Even the underground archive found a new purpose. Nadine had it professionally preserved and opened it as a small exhibition space where visitors could see the original plans and photographs from Vivienne's era. Families from Millfield brought their children to see it. Some of them stood in that cool, quiet room and cried because they finally understood why their parents had never stopped talking about the project that almost was. Fletcher contributed where he could. He used his remaining business experience to help structure some of the financial operations, negotiate contracts, and manage logistics. He did not arrive as a savior. He arrived as someone trying to earn back something that money could never buy. On weekends, he drove down from the city, rolled up his sleeves, and worked alongside people whose names he was still learning. It was slow, unglamorous work, and Fletcher discovered that he preferred it to anything he had done in his previous career. One morning in early spring, while organizing files in one of the restored office buildings, Nadine noticed a small box on a high shelf behind a row of old binders. It was easy to miss, unremarkable, covered in a light layer of dust that suggested it had been placed there long before the renovations began. She pulled it down and set it on the desk. On the lid, written in pencil, was a date. It corresponded to a day just 1 week before Vivienne's death. Nadine later confirmed with attorney Calloway that he had placed the box at the farm during one of his final visits to the property, following Vivienne's precise instructions from her bed at the nursing facility. Even in her last days, Vivienne had been arranging the pieces. Nadine opened the box slowly. Inside was a single envelope, thicker than the others she had found. The handwriting on the front was Vivienne's, but the letters were slightly uneven, as though written by a hand that was running out of strength but refused to stop. Nadine sat down. She held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The letter inside was the longest Vivienne had ever written to her. It began with the project. Vivienne described the years she had spent building it, the obstacles she had faced, the nights she had lain awake, wondering whether everything she had created would disappear the moment she was gone. She wrote about the people who had tried to take the project from her, and about the loneliness of fighting a battle that nobody else could see. Then the letter shifted. Vivienne began writing about her family, about watching each of her children and grandchildren grow into the people they became, about studying them quietly across decades of holiday dinners and birthday celebrations, and ordinary afternoons searching for the answer to a question that consumed the final years of her life. Who could be trusted to protect what mattered most? She wrote that the answer came slowly, not in a single moment of clarity, but through hundreds of small observations accumulated over years. She watched who listened and who spoke, who asked questions and who made assumptions, who measured value in dollars and who measured it in something harder to count. Then came the passage that Nadine would remember for the rest of her life. I knew the way I divided the inheritance would cause pain. I knew you would think I was punishing you. I knew you would sit in that room and watch everyone congratulate Fletcher and wonder what you had done wrong. I knew you would feel invisible, and I am sorry for that pain, Nadine. I am deeply sorry, but I had no other way. If I had explained everything in advance, the test would have lost its meaning. You had to find the truth yourself. You had to choose to stay when everyone told you to leave. You had to keep searching when the world told you there was nothing worth finding. Nadine's vision blurred. She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. Vivienne continued, and you did. You found it. You stayed. You fought. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life. The final page addressed the question that Nadine had carried since the day the will was read. What was the real inheritance? Vivienne's answer was simple and absolute. The real treasure was never money. It was never the land itself or the documents or the resources that could generate wealth. It was the model she had built, a system designed to grow across generations, a project capable of changing the lives of hundreds of families who would never know her name. Money could vanish overnight. Accounts could be drained. Properties could be seized or devalued or destroyed. But an opportunity powerful enough to transform an entire community that was something no one could take away because it lived in the people it touched. Nadine sat in the quiet office for a long time after finishing the letter. The morning light moved slowly across the desk, illuminating the pages one line at a time. She had spent months believing that Vivienne's decision had been a riddle to solve. Now she understood it had been a declaration of faith. Vivienne had not given Nadine the least valuable part of her estate. She had given her the most valuable thing she possessed, the thing she had spent her entire life building and protecting, the thing she trusted only one person in the world to carry forward. That afternoon, Nadine called Fletcher and asked him to come to the farm. When he arrived, they walked together through the property. The transformation was visible everywhere. Workers finishing their shifts, Young people heading to evening classes in the newly equipped training center, trucks loaded with produce from the cooperative fields, the sounds of machinery and conversation and purpose filling the air of a place that had been silent for decades. They climbed a low hill at the eastern edge of the property, a spot where the land rose just high enough to offer a view of the entire farm. Nadine handed Fletcher the letter. He read it standing up, the pages trembling slightly in the spring breeze. As he moved through the words, his expression changed. First curiosity, then recognition, then something that looked like grief and gratitude pressed together so tightly they became inseparable. When he finished, he held the letter at his side and stared out at the valley. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet. She was right about everything, he said. About me, about you, about this place. I looked at the numbers in my bank account and thought I had won. I thought the size of the inheritance was the measure of how much she loved me. He paused. But this is what she loved most, and she gave it to you. Nadine stood beside her brother on that hill looking down at the farm their grandmother had protected for 30 years and felt the last remaining wall between them dissolve. Not with dramatic words or tearful apologies, but with the shared understanding of two people who had finally learned the same lesson from opposite sides of the same story. Fletcher spoke once more, his voice rougher than before. I'm not the man I thought I was 6 months ago, but I'd like to be someone who deserves to help with this. Nadine looked at him. You already are. The seasons turned. Spring became summer. The project expanded. New partnerships brought resources and expertise from neighboring counties. Families who had left the valley years ago began returning, drawn by word of mouth, and the visible proof that something real was happening in a place the rest of the world had forgotten. Businesses opened along Millfield's main street. The school enrolled more children than it had in 20 years. The diner where Nadine had first met Garnett Remembers started staying open for dinner because there were finally enough people to fill the tables. One afternoon, Nadine drove through Millfield and barely recognized it. The hardware store had expanded into the adjacent lot. A new coffee roaster had opened where the vacant insurance office used to be. Two young women were painting a mural on the side of the feed store, a sweeping landscape of the valley with the words Horizon written across the sky in gold letters. Nadine slowed the truck and watched them work. One of them noticed her and waved. Nadine waved back, and for a moment she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she belonged somewhere. Nadine did not run the project alone. She built a team. She listened. She delegated. She made decisions the way Vivienne had taught her, not with the loudest voice in the room, but with the most informed one. On an evening in late June, with the sun low and golden over the mountains, Nadine walked alone to the quiet spot on the eastern hill. The fields below were green and alive. She could hear the distant hum of the training center's generator and the voices of workers heading home along the restored roads. A tractor moved slowly across the far pasture, turning earth that hadn't been planted in 3 decades. She reached into her jacket and took out Vivienne's final letter. She didn't need to read it. She knew every word. She held it in both hands and looked out at the valley that her grandmother had seen not as it was, but as it could be. Footsteps approached from behind, slow, steady, familiar. Garnett Remembers appeared beside her. He was breathing a little harder than usual from the climb, but he stood straight and looked out at the view with an expression Nadine recognized. Purpose. They stood together in silence for a long time. Your grandmother would be very happy to see this, Garnett said. Nadine smiled. She already saw it. She saw it before any of us did. Garnett nodded. The evening light softened around them. Below, someone laughed in the courtyard of the old main house. A truck door closed. A child called out across the field. From somewhere near the training center, the sound of a guitar drifted up the hill, carried by the warm evening air. And for a moment, the valley sounded exactly the way it must have sounded 35 years ago, when Vivienne stood in the same spot and imagined everything that was now becoming real. You know, Garnett said, when I was a young man, I thought the measure of a life was what you built for yourself. Took me 60 years to learn the real measure is what you build for the people who come after you. Nadine looked at him. The old man's eyes were steady and clear, the eyes of someone who had waited a very long time to see a promise kept. She looked back at the valley, at the farm that everyone had pitied her for receiving, at the land that a room full of relatives had considered worthless, at the place where a woman named Nadine Pemberton had buried her life's work in underground rooms and hidden compartments and sealed envelopes, trusting that someday someone would have the patience and the courage to dig it up. Some inheritances look small when you first receive them. Some look like burdens. Some arrive wrapped in pity and whispered doubts, in the unspoken certainty of everyone around you that you got the worst of the deal. But sometimes buried beneath what everyone else overlooks, there is something so valuable that it takes a lifetime to build in a single act of faith to pass on. Vivienne Pemberton's legacy was never a bank account or a portfolio or a row of luxury properties that could be appraised and divided and spent. It was a vision planted in the soil of a valley that the rest of the world had forgotten, protected by a woman who understood that the most important things are always the hardest to see. And now, standing on a hill overlooking the farm that had changed the lives of hundreds of families and would go on changing them for generations to come, Nadine Pemberton understood something her grandmother had known all along. The true value of an inheritance is not what it's worth on the day you receive it. It's what it becomes in the hands of the person brave enough to believe in it.